Hey, welcome back, everyone. Dr. Bogosian here. Today, we are going to continue our discussion of different ethical systems from an objectivist framework. And last time, what you heard us talk about was the system of utilitarianism. Today, we're going to look at Immanuel Kant's ethical system, which runs very much in a different direction, or maybe right at utilitarianism, if you will, because the value structure is completely different, as well as how we figure out what is right and wrong. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And while I'm getting that pulled up, you can hop over to the Canvas modules if you need to download the handout to follow along, or pause the video if you need to, and we will jump right in and look at Kant's theory. All right. What I'd like you to do, if you didn't do this at the end of last class, this is just a refresher. At the end of the last presentation, I mentioned the third criticism or objection to utilitarianism and its principle of the greatest happiness for the most people. I mentioned the innocent man in the cave case, and I'm curious what you think about that. What do you think we should do in that case and why? If you haven't already thought about that, go ahead and pause here, jot down a couple notes, and then continue watching this presentation. Okay, welcome back here. What I want to ask you here, in addition to the innocent man in the cave case, I'm going to skip bullet point 2. I want to skip down to that last one. Do you think there's ever a case where it would be right to lie? Would it ever be right to lie to, let's say, to save innocent lives? Oh, here, let me, this ties into the Corrie ten Boom case. That's a case where a real person, she was a real person during the time of Nazi Germany, and she took it upon herself to hide Jews in her home to keep them safe. And so this story usually gets rerun the following way. Imagine yourself in that scenario where you are convinced that what is being done to a certain people group is wrong, right? Holocaust or genocide. And so you take it upon yourself to help evacuate or save as many of these people as you can. And maybe while you've just recently taken a family into your home to protect them, maybe an hour later, a knock comes at your door, and you go to the door, and there stands a Nazi colonel asking you if you have any Jews in your home or you have seen any in the area. Would it be morally justified for you to lie to that person in order to protect the lives that you have taken in to your home and arguably promised to protect, let's say? Yes or no, why or why not? Now, this is a really important question because Immanuel Kant has a very strong answer to the question of whether it's okay to lie. To see how we're going to get to a very strong no, it's never right to lie, we need to understand a little bit of background that he has that's driving his moral theory. His view of human nature is in many ways different from utilitarianism, but one thing they share in common is they place a high value on human reason. Okay, objectivity it's possible for us to know the objectively right thing to do by using our human reason. But Kant goes a step further here. For him, the fact that we are rational beings, that we can reason from evidence to a conclusion or from premises to a conclusion, indicates that we have a certain kind of value as humans that lower non-human animal life forms lack, right? They don't have this. Human reason and rationality is the very foundation of morality. And what he means by that is not our reasoning processes. We don't invent morality by reasoning. Instead, we discover it. We discover the moral law, the objective, eternal moral law that's kind of built into reality. It's a feature of reality, just like math is, or the law of gravity, or what have you. And so reason is the very foundation of morality and ethics and the moral life. And furthermore, human reason is the source of our dignity, our value, and our freedom. What gives humans intrinsic value, according to Kant, is that we are beings that can deliberate between real life options, whether to date someone or not, whether to go to college or not, whether to go into work when you don't feel like it or not, or to choose between 3 or 4 food options at dinner tonight, let's say. And that's because you have a mind and the ability to weigh and consider live options and then to decide between them for the reasons that you have before you. That human freedom also pins down your value, right? Your freedom implies that you are an autonomous, rational entity that should be treated as that kind of being, that should be respected and regarded. And so your freedom, your rationality is the source of your freedom and your value, as well as moral obligations or duties that you have to yourself and others, as we'll see here. Now, how do we figure out, how we should use our reason best and whether we're using it correctly? Well, the central feature of, besides reason or connected to reason in Kant's system is the idea of the goodwill. The person who has or possesses or acts out of a goodwill is a person who uses reason to guide their acting, their willing, as opposed to acting on the basis of feeling or desire. So think about this. There's a difference between doing what I just feel impulsively to do. Maybe you get cut off on the freeway and you feel like engaging in road rage and getting back by, I don't know, gesturing and honking and flashing your lights and cutting them off or what have you. Okay, well, that's to act on the basis of your feelings and your desires in the moment that get amped up. Well, reason, if reason prevails, maybe you reason about what's wrong about that and why you shouldn't treat a person that way and why you wouldn't want to be treated that way and why it's illegal. That is to use your reasons to guide your action, to actually override your desire, as opposed to the other way around. And so a person who is a good person is a person of goodwill who allows reason to direct their actions as opposed to desire. A person of goodwill, number two, is someone who acts from a deep sense of performing their moral duties. What motivates their action is, this is what I ought to do. And it's enough that I ought to do this. It doesn't matter whether it's convenient or whether it'll get me to be well liked or not. I should do it simply because it's my duty. And the person who does the right thing, they don't do the right thing because, again, it's convenient or popular or beneficial financially. They do it simply because it's the right thing to do. So why do the right thing? Kant's answer is you do it because it's your duty and it's simply the right thing to do. You don't do it because it's going to get you liked on social media or followed on social media. You do it simply because it's what you should do. Now, one last bit of ground clearing, of background. Kant is a non-utilitarian through and through, and he thinks utilitarianism is a deeply problematic and failed ethical system for lots of reasons that will become even more clear. But for one is, the person of goodwill is one who isn't interested, let's say, is able to do what's right apart from considerations about the consequences. In fact, sometimes doing my duty, morally speaking, in Kant's view, will actually bring negative consequences to myself and maybe others. And that indicates, right, that consequences don't make a moral difference. That's not to say we should never consider the consequences. It's only to say that what makes an action right isn't the consequences. It has to do with what my moral duty is. And so the person of goodwill isn't trying to calculate consequences. They're trying to figure out what their moral obligations are. It's also an alternative utilitarianism because utilitarianism isn't concerned about your motives. They just want you to maximize, good outcomes. Remember, intention doesn't matter. For Kant, what I intend to do when I act makes a moral difference, a big moral difference. Our motives reveal what we're about, right? Whether we're a person of goodwill or not, whether we're doing our duty simply out of convenience or out of benefit to ourselves, or whether we're doing it for the right reasons because it's our duty. That brings us to his central moral concept of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is associated with Kant because it is a process of reasoning to figure out what our objective moral duties are. And he thinks if we will use our reason very clearly and methodically, we can arrive at what we should do in any given case. A categorical imperative is something that is morally in a category of its own, right? It's a set of obligations, imperatives, or commands or duties that are different than hypothetical ones that we could opt out of, like, well, if you want to have a good time, you should come over to my house. Well, you don't have to go to your friend's house to have a good time. You could opt out of that and not be doing the wrong thing. But a categorical imperative is a moral category all of its own that is binding and non-negotiable. You can disobey it or opt out in a literal sense, but you shouldn't opt out, because if it's my moral duty, that implies that others who the duty would be, fulfilling the duty would impact them, right? They have a right. If I have a duty to tell the truth, you have a right to not be lied to. If you have a right to life, I have a duty to not violate that right. So duties and rights are bound up together. They don't come apart, right? That's contrary to utilitarianism too, right? If I have a right to life, that can't be overridden in the interest of the public utility on Kant's view. That right is a moral safeguard that we should all observe, and we have duties to protect that right and honor it. So the categorical imperative, structurally speaking, is an ought statement, what you ought to do or what you ought not to do. It is categorically binding. It is absolute, meaning it's inflexible, and it's universally applicable to all people and places and time. So if we ought to tell the truth, everyone ought to tell the truth, regardless of whether they're in Vegas or in Fresno, right? It's not when in Vegas, do what happens in Vegas, and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. No, what we ought to do should be consistent across cases. And so let's look at what some of our moral obligations are, okay? There's the difference between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative, right? What you ought to do if you want to graduate is, well, do well in this class, but you might decide you don't want to go to college and you want to go get a trade, learn a trade and get a job in, some kind of trade. A categorical imperative is something like you should keep your promises. So how do we figure out what's part of the categorical imperatives? Kant has these maxims or action guiding principles. That's what a maxim is. And one of those says, act only on the maxim through which you can at the same time will, right, promote and will that it should become, that you do it, and it can become a universal law applicable to everybody else. Now think about that. That's saying if I want to do something and I'm trying to figure out if it's a right action, I have to ask myself, can I act on this principle not only for myself because I think it's a true principle, but can I encourage everyone else in society to act on the same principle without it leading to a logical contradiction? All right, so let's take an example here. Let's suppose you want to promise to do something for someone, but you're not really sure you can make good on the promise, but you're saying it because you know they want to hear it and it's going to benefit you to make the promise in some way. And so here you would be making what's called a false promise. You're making a promise you don't intend to keep, right? You won't make good on it. Is it okay to make promises you don't intend to keep? Is it okay to make promises that you probably won't follow through on? Well, Kant thinks the answer is no. Why? Well, okay, let's start with the claim. It's okay, it's right to make a promise I don't intend to keep. That's premise one in the argument. All right, that's my maxim or my action guiding principle. Make a promise. It's okay to make a promise I don't intend to keep. Step two now is, okay, now I have to make that a universal law. It's also okay for you to make promises that you don't intend to keep. But now step three is, we could get in a scenario where we're both making promises we don't intend to keep, but I would be willing that you not only tell me the truth, but make a promise that you don't intend to keep. But I would be also wanting you to, right? You see the problem there? That leads to a contradiction where it would both be the case that I would be willing that you promise and keep your promises, but willing that you make a promise you don't intend to keep. And that's a logical contradiction. All contradictions must be false. That implies then that the logical opposite of that has to be true. That is, we should only make promises we do intend to keep, because that won't lead to the contradiction. Let's take another one. Let's take lying. Is it ever right to lie, like we started with? Step one, yes, it's right to lie it's right to lie sometimes. Step two, well, then I would make that a universal law where it's right for you to lie. Sometimes it's right for me to lie sometimes. So that means I would be willing that it's right for me to lie and right for you to lie. But then that could lead to a situation where I'm both willing that I want you to tell the truth, right? If I ask you a question, but I'm willing that you not tell me the truth by my choosing to tell the truth and not tell the truth in this case. But that's a contradiction. That implies that lying is wrong always and everywhere. Therefore, I should always tell the truth. Okay. So lying is always and everywhere wrong. I ought to always make promises that I only promises that I intend to keep. Now, there's another way to come at this. That's really abstract, right? The categorical imperative has three versions depending on who you read, maybe four. But the second version is a really important one, and it's more tangible. And it's the idea that we should treat all humans as uh, as human beings, as ends in themselves, beings that have intrinsic worth, worthy of dignity and respect. Okay, so act to treat all humans, this includes you as and others, never simply merely as a means, but always as an ends. Okay, we can see why we'll be able to also see why lying is wrong on this version. But this is an important version that you'll see will tie into his view of the human person as having free will and having reason, and that pinning down our value. What is you should circle the word merely here, okay, or never simply as simply there on the slide as a means, okay. If you're an end, if you're an individual that has intrinsic value, I should never act towards you in a way that would compromise that value, that would degrade or demean or diminish that value. Well, I diminish that value when I make any decision towards you that would treat you merely or simply as a means to my own ends. And that is going to happen anytime we don't have reasonable, where we haven't collectively reasoned and understood each other and presented the relevant evidence to agree on the ends we're pursuing together. So let me give you some examples that do not violate this principle. Let's suppose that you're a server at a restaurant and I come in to purchase food for dinner. Well, you've been hired there, so you agree to work there to provide the service to people like myself who dine in there. I'm agreeing to treat you with dignity and respect as your server and pay for the food and so on. So we have a mutual exchange of goods and services. We've agreed upon the, if you will, implicitly agreed upon the terms and conditions, you by working there and me by coming there. Now, I could violate those implicit terms of exchange, the system of exchange by yelling at you if my food comes out burnt, demeaning you. Okay, that would be treating you merely as a means to my feeling good about getting back, sticking it to the man who didn't give me what I wanted. Right? There are better ways to treat you to uphold your dignity and still uphold my dignity by getting what I've ordered, right? Which is a non-burnt meal. But just right, using, the point here is using you as a means to my end of getting dinner, and you using me as a means to a paycheck is not violating this principle. How this principle gets violated is any action towards another where you manipulate them, deceive them, degrade them and diminish them verbally, name calling, or physical assault or sexual assault, all the way to other kinds of bodily harm, domestic abuse, murder, and so on. But this would also apply to how you treat yourself. So you also have limits to how you should never treat yourself simply as a means. And so what this looks like is when you use someone, including yourself, as a means to their own to your own ends, you have to go around their freedom, right? So if you manipulate someone, what you're usually doing is using your words to convince them to do something they may not want to do. And so you're either deceiving or lying or saying things to them to get them to do what you want, even though if they just knew transparently what was going on, they probably wouldn't want to do it. Well, what that's doing is that's going around their reason. It's circumventing their reason, and it's going around their freedom. You're not treating them as a free, rational being who's entitled to all the relevant, transparent evidence being on the table to make an informed decision. And so thereby you degrade their humanness, right? Their rationality and their freedom, their dignity. And that would violate version 2 of the categorical imperative. Lying does that, right? When I lie to you, I'm trying to not be forthcoming with you about the truth. And that treats you as something as less than human, someone who's not worthy of the relevant data and information so that you can make now a free decision of how you want to respond to the truth. Now, what's really interesting is you and I, right, both have inherent or intrinsic value. And we have that because we're rational, we morally evaluate things. And so coercion and manipulation are clearly wrong because they would reduce the person just as to a mere means to your ends. They don't treat them as an end in their own right. But you can degrade your own person, your own self, by misusing your body. This would be whether it's a eating disorder, cutting, overdoing anything, over consuming, right? Or committing suicide. And that's because for Kant, yes, we're free and we should be free to do not just as we want, but as we ought to do. And so anytime our desires conflict with what we ought to do, then the want is suspect. So you could do what you want as long as it's within keeping of the categorical imperative, but you can't use your body any way you want. It turns out on Kant's view, right, you can't, he would have a problem with friends with benefits and casual sex because you're actually using each other, even though let's say it's consensual, you're reducing each other as mere means to, let's say, the end of sexual gratification. And he thinks if you're really treating a sexual partner as an end in themselves and they treating you that way, you would be interested in a union, a physical union that is a long-term committed union, okay? And so this is all very interesting, right? This applies to any domain, friendship, significant others, working relationships, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the interest of time, I want to keep things moving. What are some objections to Kant's view? It's pretty clear here that this opens, his view is open, at least his own kind of Kantianism is open to our duties coming into conflict in some cases. Take that Corrie ten Boom case I gave you at the beginning. Pretty clearly, if you've taken some Jews into your home to hide them, to protect them from harm by the Nazis, you've implied that you're going to protect them. You've got an obligation to make good on that promise, right? That's a duty you now have, but you also, let's say, have a duty to tell the truth, and those duties have equal weight. They don't admit of exceptions. They're both equally, absolutely binding on you. But they're in Kant's scheme, right? There's really no way to make good on those or to balance those out or to act and fulfill both duties. About the best you could do is to figure out a savvy way to not lie to the colonel and save their lives in some way. But you can't lie to save their lives and you can't give them up, okay? Now, you could be a Kantian in another way. Okay, so I'm going to sidestep Kant's actual view. There are lots of people who are Kantian today, but think that you can stay broadly Kantian in the relevant way, but because morality is all about doing your duties and so on, but that it's rational to rank your moral duties in certain hard cases like the one I've given you. And sometimes we might always have to do this, right? You might have a duty to your job and a duty to your family, but sometimes those come in conflict. Well, there you might have to prioritize the duty to your family, even though that might lead to getting written up at work, right? And so you have to figure those out. But in the Corrie ten Boom case, current day Kantians would say it's okay to lie to the Nazi colonel. That doesn't mean we can tell so-called white lies. It just means, and it doesn't mean that lying is generally right. It means that in this case, all things considered, it's morally justified for you to save the innocent life because that takes precedent or more moral weight over the telling of the truth in that case. All right, the second objection, though, is that reason, where Kant places all of his emphasis on human moral psychology and sort of morality and right and wrong. Reason, while very powerful and important, isn't sufficient as the sole source of morality. And why we might think this is because we have the clear experience where sometimes we reason incorrectly, we get it wrong, morally speaking and otherwise. And so if reason is sometimes open to error, we need to have something else that it helps us account for or supplement reason. And what some things that supplement reason could be care or love or virtues. And you get that in people like Aristotle or feminist ethics and so on. In fact, to add to that, some people, other moral systems, are concerned that Kant's ethical system is kind of too kind of cold and legalistic. You can do your moral duty without caring for others, right? You can do your duty simply because it's your duty, and end of story. But that doesn't mean that it's coming from a place of deep concern for other human beings, right? You could see this, maybe you take a military analogy, right? Or a parent, well, I got to do this. They don't really love their kids, but they don't want to go to jail, and they're just doing their parental duties. And so virtue ethical systems like Aristotle's and others want to say reason without virtue leads to just sort of a cold, legalistic framework. And we want to have more, we want to do our duties, but we want to do them for not just because they're our duties, but because we're trying to be virtuous people, right? And we want to have in place certain character traits that actually help us do what we ought to do from a good sort of character and a good heart, and for the right reasons, which includes virtuous motivations. A fifth concern here, and I'm going to actually skip that one for today. I'm going to just leave us with this third one, excuse me. I want you to think about these objections, and I want you to go back to your notes from the utilitarianism presentation and compare and contrast what's different between these two systems. The main shortcoming of utilitarianism, right, is it seems that in certain cases you could have your human value overridden and your rights overridden in the interest of social utility, and that seems very problematic. Well, if we go the direction of Kant, he's got an answer to that. We should always privilege, right, human worth. That's the greatest worth. But then there are these tensions. Which system do you find to be more plausible, and why? And I'll look forward to hearing from you, maybe in the discussion boards or in an email. Or if you'd like to chat over, during office hours, I'm happy to connect with you and talk about these things. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day and your week. We'll see you next time.